Hello and welcome to the Intro to GIMP workshop with Studio Co. My name is Toby and I'll be guiding you through this workshop today. Now before we get started, I just want to make it clear that this workshop is geared towards people who have never used GIMP before. This might be people who have never even opened the application, much less done any actual photo editing or digital painting inside of it. So if that doesn't sound like you, this might not be the workshop for you. With that being said, what we're going to cover in this workshop is how to get started, how to open an image, how to use most of the tools, how to work with some of the shortcuts, and how to apply filters, color adjustments, and that sort of thing. So let's go ahead and get started. The first thing you'll want to do is open GIMP. For me, I have a shortcut on my desktop, so I'm just going to double click on it and wait for it to get rolling. Once GIMP opens up, you'll be greeted with this window. At the top, you'll have your standard navigation bar like you'd see in most programs. Below that, on the far left, you have your tools. Below your tools, you have your tool options. This big window in the middle with the GIMP character poking his head out is your canvas, and this is where we'll actually do the editing once we open an image. And then on the right side of the screen, we have our brushes, patterns, and fonts panel. And on the bottom right, we have our layers. So to get started in GIMP, you have a couple of options. You can either go File, New, and create a completely blank canvas, or you can go Open and work with an existing image. For our sake, we're going to click Open. And if you want to follow along with the same images that I use in this tutorial, you can follow the Google Drive link in the comments and download the images from there. So let's go ahead, we'll open Better Portrait first. And we'll go File, Open, Screaming Sun second. And we're gonna work with this Screaming Sun page first, but you'll notice that both of our images are up top at the middle, are up top on top of our canvas. So before we get rolling with editing, I just want to cover a few basic shortcuts. So the first two are undo and redo. So to undo, the shortcut on Windows is Control-C, on Mac it'd be Command-Z, but I'm going to be using Windows shortcuts for this tutorial. So Control-Z undoes, and normally you'd expect Control-Shift-Z to redo, but that's not the case in GIMP. In GIMP, it's actually Control-Y. So Control-Z, undo, Control-Y, redo. Cool. The other two shortcuts I want to talk about before we get started are the zooming and panning shortcuts. So if you hit plus on your number pad or minus, that's how you zoom in and out. And if you hold down the space bar, no matter which tool you have selected, and move your mouse around, that's how you pan around the image. So again, it's Control-Z to undo, Control-Y to redo, plus and minus to zoom in and out, and spacebar to pan. And on that note, let's get going. So the first thing I'll show you guys are the colors adjustments. So if you click on colors in your top navigation bar, you'll be greeted with a bunch of different options. You can desaturate, which brings it to grayscale. You can do saturation, hue saturation, brightness, contrast, all sorts of different adjustments. And I'm going to go ahead and click on brightness, contrast. And then you'll see I can really, start to change the feel of this image. Let's bring the brightness back down. Bring the contrast back down a little bit. Okay, so now you can see that made quite a difference already. And I encourage you to just sort of play with all of these, kind of get a grasp on what they do. One thing to be aware of is that after you make a change, it's permanent. It's not like in Photoshop where you can do an adjustment layer and then delete the layer later on. In GIMP, after you make one of these corrections, it's just embedded in the image. So if you were to continue working on this and then all of a sudden decide that you don't like the adjustment, there's not really a good way to delete it without undoing all of the work that you've done since applying the adjustment. So just be aware. Alright, the first tool I'm going to show you guys is the rectangle select tool. It is the top left tool in your toolbar. And how it works is you basically can click and drag to create a selection area. And you'll notice that each time I click and drag, it creates a new box. One thing to note with this tool, you have these different modes over here, but they're accessible by using shortcuts. So if you hold down Shift, you'll notice a little plus icon appear by the tool, and then you can add to your extant selection. If you hold Option, or excuse me, Control, not Option. If you hold Control, you'll notice a little minus appears, and then you can subtract from your extant selection area. So let's go ahead, let's just grab a little swath of the foreground with our selection tool. And what a selection area does is it basically tells the program that you only want to be working inside of that area. So if I were to use my brush and try to paint out here, it doesn't do anything. But if I paint in here, now you can see it. So let's go ahead with our selected area. Let's apply another color correction. And this time, let's go hue saturation. Why not? And let's change the hue a little bit. Or a lot. Let's make it blue. Why not? Let's increase the saturation as well. Okay. So already our image is looking vastly different than it did when we started. So now let's assume we're done working with this area. How do we deselect? The shortcut for deselecting in GIMP is Control-Shift-A. So you'll notice when I hit Control-Shift-A, that bounding box disappears, and now we're working with the entire image again. So the Ellipse tool works the same way as the rectangle tool. It's the next tool in our toolbar, shortcut E. But instead of rectangles, it makes elliptical selection areas. Cool. So you guys get the picture, so I'm not going to harp on this too long. I'm just going to go ahead and deselect and show you the free select tool. This is another way to make selection areas, but basically how the free select tool works is you click, hold, and drag, and then draw the area that you want to select. So I'm going to use the free select tool to try and select these mountains. I'm going to zoom in and pan over so I get a little better view of them. So I'll click, hold, drag around the mountains. Oh, messed up a little bit there. And you'll notice when you get back to your origin point, it'll turn yellow, and that means you've made a closed shape. So now with this selection area, I'm going to go ahead and use a filter. So a filter works sort of like a color correction, except it's usually a little more exaggerated or more weird. It's not as straightforward as like hue and brightness and contrast. It's more like applying a complex, well, filter, for lack of a better word. So I'm going to go ahead with my mountains selected. I'm going to click on Artistic, and I am going to choose Cubism. And now you can see, and you can change the tile size and whatnot before we accept it, but I'm going to keep it pretty small. And now when we hit OK, we have our cubist mountains in the background. All right, so now let's switch over to our foreground object and continue our demo over there. I'm gonna go ahead and zoom in a little bit. So before we make any actual adjustments to this, basically what we're going to do is cut this guy out of his background and paste it into the other image, but I'm going to demonstrate a few tools before we actually get started on that. So one tool that comes in handy is the flip tool, shortcut Shift F, and you can see it in the third row, third column of the toolbar. And basically you just select it, and when you click, it mirrors the image. Pretty straightforward. The other tool I wanted to cover right now is the crop tool, shortcut Shift C. And this basically allows you to click, drag, and create a new image with the crop area. So you can see a preview, and when I hit, I can actually adjust these edges if I want first. And then when I hit enter, our image is resized. Okay, so now how are we going to go about getting this guy out of his background? This is where the other selection tools come in handy. So the fuzzy select tool, basically what it does is it allows you to pick a color and the program will choose the entire contiguous region that contains that color. So if I want to get rid of this orange, all I have to do is click, and anywhere that the orange is touching itself, it will automatically pick. And you can see it did a pretty good job, but it's still missing a few spots here and there. So if we go ahead, I'm going to go ahead and undo that, Control Z. If we change our threshold, we can change the tolerance basically for the variation from the color that you select. So if I have a low threshold, like if my threshold were 0, it'll only pick up on the exact hue that I click on. But if my threshold is higher, we're able to basically pick colors that are further away from the one we click on. So let's double our threshold from the original 30, or from the original 15 to about 30. And now when we click, you can see it gets the oranges, the darker oranges down here as well. And that looks pretty good to me. So now what we want to do basically is invert our selection, because right now, like if I deleted this, you can see that we have the background selected. But what we actually want is this person in the foreground. That's what we're going to copy and paste. So in order to select him instead of the background, we need to invert our selection area, and the shortcut to invert is Control I. So if I hit Control I and then I hit delete, now you can see I'm deleting the person. I'm going to go ahead and undo that. So we have our person selected, and now we need to copy him and paste him into the original image. So I'm going to go ahead and hit Control C. That is the shortcut for copy. I'm going to click back over to our Screaming Sun layer, and I'm going to hit Control V. That's the shortcut for paste. And now you can see we have this man in our original image. You'll notice when I paste, it's pasted as a floating selection, and these options down here light up green. You actually, after you paste something inside of GIMP, I don't know why they did it this way, but they did, you have to click this little green icon on the far left of your layers panel to actually paste it as a layer. And you can see the name changes from floating selection to pasted layer. One thing to note before we do anything with our pasted layer is the way layers work inside of GIMP. Whichever layer appears on the top of the layers panel also appears on the top of the canvas. So if I took this pasted layer and moved it below the Screaming Sun layer, I guess you can't just click and drag in GIMP, you have to use these little icons. But you'll notice if I click down here, lower the layer, suddenly it's behind the Screaming Sun. So it's still there actually, it's just not appearing because the Screaming Sun is over it. And you'll see if we grab our Screaming Sun layer and move it, there he is. So I'll go ahead and undo that, grab the pasted layer and put it back on top. Cool, so the next tool we're going to work with is the Move tool. It's one of the most important tools inside of GIMP. It allows you to move your different layers. And it's this omnidirectional arrow, shortcut M in the toolbar. And you'll notice, if I click and drag, I can move my layers. So let's click and drag our pasted layer, and we'll move this dude into the corner. And if we want to get him aligned perfectly, we can actually use an alignment tool. So you'll see next to the Move tool, we have our alignment tool. And basically these different options here let the tool move. So right now it says relative to first item. That'd be if I had two things selected. So if let's say I grab the Screaming Sun, and then grabbed him, you can see he's moving relative to the Screaming Sun layer. If I want him to move relative to the entire image, I can just change to image, and now you can see he's aligned perfectly at the bottom and on the left. Okay, so let's cover a few more transform tools with this little guy. And let's grab next the Unified Transform tool. So the Unified Transform tool allows you to just grab a layer and basically manipulate it a large number of ways by clicking on the different points. So you see you can rotate, you can stretch, you can do all sorts of weird things. I'm gonna just get them looking real weird. And to finalize your transformation, you hit enter. Next, we have our rotate tool, which allows you to click, hold, and rotate. I'm gonna go ahead and undo that. You have your scale tool, which is pretty self-explanatory. Allows you to resize your selected layer. And then the shear tool, which allows you to shear the selection. And all of those are in the second row, the last four columns. Okay, so now I'm going to show you guys the warp transform tool, which is pretty interesting. This actually works sort of like a brush, and it's a good time to know a shortcut. So if you use your left and right brackets, you can increase and decrease the sizes of your tools. You'll notice you can also change the size over here, but it's much easier and much more practical to use your brackets. So let's go ahead and shrink this. And how the warp tool works is it basically allows you to grab part of your image and then just pull it in any direction. So I'm going to grab the Screaming Sun layer. You'll notice if I try to do anything on the background right now, it won't work because my pasted layer is selected. So I'm going to grab my Screaming Sun layer, and you can see now how the warp transform tool functions. Cool. In contrast with the warp select tool, I also want to cover the smudge tool right now. So that's the second to last tool in your toolbar. And the smudge tool works very similarly. I'm going to go ahead and change my brush. But the difference is that your selection fades. You can see how it starts with the really strong yellow from the sun and then gradually fades out, almost like you're blending paint on a canvas. Whereas the warp tool keeps those hard edges wherever you're warping. And I'll go ahead and just mess with this sun a little bit. Okay. So next up, let's cover the Paintbrush tool. This might be a favorite for some of you watching. If you're planning on doing digital painting, this will be your core tool. So the Paintbrush tool is shortcut P. It is in the first column, fourth row. And basically how it works is you just click, hold, and drag to paint. But there's a lot more to this tool than that. So you remember we have our brush panel over here. We can use any number of different brushes to get a whole wide variety of effects. We can change the size with our brackets, or over here, you can play with these other settings. I'm not going to cover them in detail right now. You can also access your brush library inside of your tool options by clicking right there. You can see, you can draw just a whole pepper if that's what you want to do. And then the last thing to note is the color picker, so you can double click on your foreground color up top, up here with your tools, and that's where you have the option to change your paint color. I want to make note of another tool while I'm covering the paintbrush. So you also have your eyedropper shortcut. O, I believe. Yep, there it is, top right corner, the color picker tool. And basically this just allows you to click anywhere and change your foreground color to the color where you click. So let's say I want to use this pink in the sun's mouth. I can just click and you'll see my foreground color up here turns to pink. Then I can press P for my paintbrush, and I'm using that pink. O for color picker, P for paintbrush, and I'm using the green of the grass. I'm gonna go ahead and get rid of those, and I'll use the paintbrush just to make this sun look like he's breathing a whole beam of miniature suns. Cool. Alright, so before we move on, I just want to cover the other tools that are sort of similar to the paintbrush. So we have our pencil tool. Basically, the pencil tool makes a hard edge no matter what brush you're using. So I'll show you, if I use the paintbrush and I have this like soft tool selected, I'll make it a little bit bigger so you can see what's going on. So you can see the middle is the green that I have selected, but then it gradually bleeds out of opacity from the center. But if I use the pencil tool, even if I have a tool with a soft edge selected, a brush with a soft edge, it's still gonna be just the solid green everywhere. It doesn't change opacity. So that's the pencil tool. We have our airbrush tool, which basically just starts with a lower opacity than the paintbrush tool and allows you to build up layers slowly over time as if you're using spray paint. I'm gonna go ahead and get rid of those as well. We also have the ink tool, the calligraphy tool, and basically this allows you to replicate ink strokes based on the speed that you pull your mouse as you paint. And I'll show you what I mean by this. So if I click, hold, and drag, and I drag very slowly, it's gonna be a really wide stroke. But then if I move fast, suddenly it gets thin. So slow and wide, fast and narrow. Okay, and that about does it for the paintbrush and paintbrush related tools that I'd like to cover in this tutorial. So next up, let's use the paint bucket tool. So the paint bucket tool is a pretty interesting one. Shortcut Shift B. How it works is it basically allows you to fill in regions with a color. So let's say I wanted to make these clouds the same pink as the tongue. Oh, let's grab my color picker, grab my paint bucket, and now you can see I'm painting in the clouds. You'll notice you have a threshold option similar to your fuzzy select, so you can mess with the amount that's going to be affected. Let me turn that back up. And you'll be able to see this really well on something like the sun, where it's all flat color. You can see how easily we can make those changes. Something else that's kind of fun to note about the paint bucket tool. So you can use foreground color, which uses this color here. You can use background color. Let's change that to red. And now we can change back and forth from red to pink. Or you can use pattern fills. And you can access your pattern fills right here, but you can also access the patterns up here in your patterns panel. So let's just grab a random one. This one looks kind of fun. You'll see we get these swirlies. And let's do something like that. Why not? Actually, I like it more there. The teeth. Okay, So next up we have our eraser tool, which is pretty self-explanatory. Shortcut Shift E. I'm going to use it on the pasted layer. So shortcut tool, you have access to all the same brushes as your paintbrush tools. I'm gonna go ahead and grab this little guy, and basically you just click, hold, and drag to erase whatever it is you want to erase on your selected layer. So I'm gonna go ahead, zoom in, pan, and I'm gonna get rid of this guy's glasses. Okay. Now you can see that blue grass from the other side, poking through homeboy sunglasses. All right, so next let's cover the clone stamp tool. I'm gonna go ahead and grab the Screaming Sun layer again. And the clone stamp tool, or pardon me, just the clone tool. Clone stamp is Photoshop. Shortcut C. So how this tool works, this one's a little different. Again, you can use all the same brushes that you use for your paintbrush tools. So I'm gonna go ahead and keep this one selected. And how the clone tool works is you basically select the area that you want to clone, and then you can paint a clone of your selection. So I'm gonna go ahead, I'm gonna hold down Control, and before you use the tool, you can see I have like the little stop symbol right now. So we have to define our origin point. So if I hold Control and then click, I just copied that eye, and you can see on the screen which area I have set as my origin point. Now when I click, it'll create that eye, and it'll start to repaint my entire image based on that origin point. Note that once I release my mouse, if I were to click again, it would restart from the origin point. And if I ever wanted to reset the origin point, I can just hold Control and click somewhere else. So now you can see. Another thing to note that's pretty cool is when you're drawing, you can see the origin point moving, so you always know which part of the image you're drawing. I'm gonna go ahead and just get rid of all of those. So now I want to talk about the healing tool, which is pretty similar to the clone tool, but different in a significant way. So I'm going to go ahead and grab it. The shortcut is H. Again, we can use all of our brushes and change some of the settings down here. So like the clone tool, with the healing tool, you have to hold Control to set your origin point. But then when you paint, whatever you paint interacts with what's already there. So you can see that it's kind of taking this information from our origin point and blending it with the information below instead of just copying it outright. So I'm gonna go ahead, duplicate this guy a couple times. Cool, that's looking pretty weird, pretty fun. So we can move on. All right, so the next tool I want to cover is the Dodge Burn tool. And it is the very last tool in your toolbar, shortcut B. So basically what dodging or burning does is it brightens or darkens the image. And again, you can use all of the various brushes available to you. So it's automatically set to dodge, and if I just start painting, you'll notice that I'm brightening up wherever I paint. You can see if I undo and redo what a difference that makes. Now if I wanted to dodge instead of burn, all I have to do is hold Control. You'll notice the icon changes, and now when I click and start painting, everything gets darker. Cool, make this foreground really dark. All right. So that about does it. The last tool I want to show you guys, it's a pretty important tool, is the text tool. So with the text tool, you can either just click and start typing, or let's go ahead and delete this layer. Or you can click, hold, and drag and define the size of your text box before you start typing. So I'll just say, hello, starshine. The Earth says, I messed it up. Good morning, starshine. The Earth says hello. Okay. You'll notice after you type, you can select your text, you can change the color of it, you can change the font, you can change, so you'll actually want to go over here to your font book if you want to change the font. And yeah, oh, let's go ahead and, okay. So you'll notice, one thing to notice with the text tool, whenever you use the text tool, it creates a new layer. You can move it down, move it up. And you can always, with your text tool and your text layer selected, click, hold, and drag to edit it later. And I will point out that you can change the opacity of any of your selected layers. So if we wanted this to sort of fade into the sky a little bit, I can just drop the opacity like so. And then work on it. Oh. Like I would any other layer. Okay, so that covers most of the basic tools inside of Blender. We covered the various selection tools, the various editing tools. We've kind of talked about layers. I've shown you guys colors and filters. And the last thing I need to show you to wrap this baby up is how to save and export. So in order to save, you'll just come up to File. If you haven't saved yet, you'll want to do Save As the first time. You can define where you want to save your folder, or your file, pardon me. You can name it up here before you save it, so I'll call this Practice 1, or Practrice, I guess, since I cannot type. And then you'll hit Save. Before I do, I just want to show that this saves as an XCF file, which is Blender's native file, which means you won't be able to really use this image anywhere but Blender. So let's go ahead and save it. The reason you always want to save your XCF is in case you want to come back and work on this image again later. You'll still have all of your same layers, you'll still have all the different options. This will still read as a text layer. It's just a file that you need to have. And after you've saved as once, then you can just hit save and it'll save it wherever you have it stored. Alright, so now let's say you're completely done, you've worked on your project to completion, you're ready to share it on the interwebs or print it or whatever it is that you're trying to do with it. What you want to do is go to File, Export As, and then you can save it as a PNG. I'm going to go ahead and click Export. You'll notice our PNG options pop up. I'm going to go ahead and change my color to RGB. Why not? You can change the compression level to change the size and detail level of the image. When you're done, everything looks good. You can export. And now you have both your GIMP file and your PNG. And that, my friends, does it for the Intro to GIMP workshop with Studio Co. Just a reminder that these images can be downloaded from the Google Drive link. Inside that link, I've also included a step-by-step breakdown of this workshop. So if you're a staff member and you're trying to teach it, you can follow along with that guide. If you are a patron and you just learn better having the step-by-step text in front of you, then it is there for you as well. Alright, thank you so much for your time. I hope you learned something. I hope you feel a little more comfortable with GIMP. And if you need any help whatsoever, always remember that you can come in to Studio Co. room 237 at the University of Wyoming's Co. Library. Alright, peace and love, my friends.